Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland, chat to some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry we're in of writing and self-publishing. And today we are delighted to have a very special guest calling in all the way from Cyprus. And I'm very, very excited to talk to Mr. Myron Edwards, who is a freelance writer. He's got a long and storied career in comedy, including some of the shows that I grew up on. So I'm really excited to hear about that. He's also an author of a Cyprus mystery series. So Myron, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you, Roland, and thank you for the opportunity. It's hot and sweaty here today, so I'm in the right environment, put it that way. Yeah.
And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing well, thanks, Roland, and thanks, Myron. I know you're all the way in Cyprus. That's pretty far away. So and the time zone I know is very different. It's I think nighttime for you. So we appreciate you making some time for us here. And you have such a great history of writing for British comedy shows and sitcoms and sketch comedy and all that stuff. So that's something that I think is a good sort of topic to talk about with our audiences. Most of us are self-published authors of novels and short stories, novellas. So this sort of thing is sort of another avenue. Plus, you might have some insight about how to write comedy for to put into novels and stories as well, and how it differs maybe from sitcoms. So why don't you tell us a bit about how you all got started with this stuff and where your career's taking you and how you got to where you are now.
Okay. Well, I'm going to tracy this because it needs to just to quickly give you an introduction. I was a drummer in a rock band, and a chap that I worked with worked in Hammer Films in London, and we were all in the same band together. And one day he came to me and said to her, "Look, I've got a friend in Hospital Radio in Charing Cross. He needs some sketches." And I said, "Oh, good God, I've never written any sketches." So he said, "Well, we need some sketches because it's for the patients. And what you can do is you can record them as well and play them to the patients." So end of story. We did six lots of series for the patients, and they loved it. Great, wonderful. We had all this material left over, all the sketches we'd written and everything else. And Phil decided he wanted to send them to Dave Allen because Dave Allen was a really top comic then in those days. So we sent it to Dave Allen. Unfortunately, it was right at the end of the series of Dave Allen because he used to do his recordings on a week-by-week basis, but it was right at the end. He said the guy wrote back, said, "Yeah, it's really nice stuff, really good stuff. Next time the next series comes up, we'll consider you for doing that." In the meantime, the gags that we sent, we also sent to the Two Ronnies. Now, the Two Ronnies was the biggest comedy duo in the UK at that time. And I don't know whether it was luck or kismet. I think it's a bit of both. We got on the Christmas show, and that was a huge thing. The popular, what shall I say? The broadcast audience must have been something like 20 million. So, but it was fantastic to be able to go onto the Two Ronnies and have a gag put on there. To be in that sort of company was incredible. That gave us the bug. From there, what we then did was we looked for different comedy areas to, shall we say, make our names a bit more recognizable. So we went into a really nice guy, a chap called Roy Hudd. He had a weekly program called the Hudlines. Now, the Hudlines was open to anybody and everybody, and it meant that what you could do is you could send in a gag or whatever, or a sketch or something, and the producer would look at it. Well, the producer for Hudlines at that time was a chap called John Lloyd. Now, John Lloyd is a very famous guy because he's the guy who produced Blackadder. And he's produced lots of other stuff as well, but Blackadder is his main so we say sitcom, and everybody knows how famous Blackadder is with Rowan Atkinson, etc. So I was in at the right area when I talk about the people that I was working with. I was working with Roy Hudd, and he had several people who were also in and around that area. David Jason, who went on to do Only Fools and Horses. And then I had people very similar. Griff Rhys-Jones, who was actually a producer on Weekending, which was the second show that I did. Now, Weekending was different to Headlines because what it was it was more satirical. Headlines was more funny one-liner gags, whereas Weekendings were sketches. So I would write sketches for Weekendings as well as doing one-liner things like the news next week and things like that. And some of the producers that I was lucky enough to work with, I worked with John on there, I worked with Griff Rhys-Jones, and I also worked with Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So I was in and around with those kind of people. Unfortunately, I was married at the time, and I do mean unfortunately because it was the first one. It was a disaster. And unfortunately, then it was a case of pay the mortgage or get out. So at that time, if I'd known better, I would have got out. But unfortunately, I stuck with the mortgage. So I was in a situation where I was able to get in, but I couldn't get into the echelon, if you like, the inner circle, because in doing that, you would have had to do that on a full-time basis. So I was lucky enough, I got in on the outside, on the periphery, and Phil and I worked on various sketches, and we worked I worked mainly on Weekendings and Headlines, and then we got into TV. Not the 9 o'clock news, which was also produced by John Lloyd. That was with Rowan Atkinson, Mel Smith, Pamela Stevenson, and Griff Rhys-Jones, because Griff Rhys-Jones took over from Richard Langham on the first episode. Now Griff was a really good, nice guy. He's done some really good stuff. He worked with Alias Smith and Jones with Mel Smith. Unfortunately, Mel died very young, as indeed Douglas Adams did. And it was then a case of where do I go from here when I'm still working, I'm still doing writing. But at the time, I was fortunate enough to continue my writing because I went into copywriting. I worked in travel for 30 years. That's where my main career was. But I diversified, and what I did was I moved into JWT. I was running JWT as a travel manager, but then I went into JWT, and people said to me, "Well, you do writing and that. Why don't you become a copywriter?" I was like, "Oh, what the hell's a copywriter? I have no idea what a copywriter is." So they said to me, "Well, it's somebody who does all the adverts. You know, they create all the campaigns and that." And I thought, "Oh, well, all right, I'll give it a go." They said, "Well, it's not that easy. You've got to pass the copy test first of all. So first of all, you've got 10 questions which are practically impossible to answer, and I'm not going to them now. But they basically test your creativity, and I passed the copy test. I was the first one in 3 years that I passed the copy test. I did some sample ads as well, which were Guinness ads. I had to take the original Guinness ad, take that out, and do another gag." And then I was lucky enough to be promoted up from the first floor or the bottom floor up to the third floor where the creative team were. So I was working in JWT. I was still doing the BBC. I was running backwards and forwards like a blue-ass fly, trying to get my sketches done, getting my comedy done, getting everything done. And then along came an opportunity as well for me to work with Scottish television, and there was a program called Kick Up the 80s, which was with oh God, the woman who I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name. I'll come back to it. She was the one who basically had Tracy Ullman, got it. She was the one who introduced The Simpsons. Okay, she had a Tracy Ullman show, and for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, she brought The Simpsons on as an introduction. So they showed The Simpsons. Tracy was then doing her own show in America, but prior to that, she did some sketches for a Kick Up the 80s. So I was lucky enough to have her sketch done, my sketch done by her on a Kick Up the 80s. So that was another string in my bow, so to speak, because I got onto Scottish television from there. And then at that time, there was some aggravation at home. Decided that we'd go the separate ways, and we went the separate ways. But also at the same time, when I was writing for JWT, there was a complete disaster with the advertising world. Normally, the advertising world is, particularly for JWT, it's advertising for TV and radio. And what happened was there was an ITV strike. So bang, everything went out the window. The ITV strike was the first time in their history that they stopped all the commercials on the television. And of course, that was revenue that went completely out of the window. So I was left with the choice of being made redundant, which is what probably that I did. And then from there, I went back into the travel business. I went back into a merchant bank. No, I was still doing writing as well, but not to the sort of level that I was before. The programs were still there, headlines were still there, weekendings were still there, but I had to then decide what I was going to do. The next thing that I did, and this has nothing to do with comedy, but I'll just tell you what I did afterwards. One night I was coming back from London, where I was coming back on the tube. Sorry, not on the tube. The tubes, there was a tube strike. So I was walking back and I looked at my watch and I thought, right, I'll bugger this. I'm going to take some shortcuts. So I took shortcuts back from Tottenham Court Road to Liverpool Street. And it took me less time in many ways than it would have if I'd gone on the tube. So I thought to myself, well, hold on, this is seems like a good idea. So about a week later, I met up with a taxi driver who knew the knowledge of London. And I said to him, what's the chances of you being able to do, say, 12 maps of just different directions from Fenchurch Street, Liverpool Street, and all the rest of it? And I created a map book. And this map book was called Tube Walking. And it showed you how to get from A to B using just taxi drivers' knowledge of A to B. And it gave you the route and it gave you the time and everything else. So that got me back into the publicity side of things. And then from there, I just went on looking for different jobs. I became... where did I go from there? I'm just trying to think. After I left Tube Walking, I went into Chinatown and worked back in the travel agency business. I think that covers my sort of background until I moved here to Cyprus, which was in 2004.
Wow, it's quite the resume you have there.
It's a checkered career. Yeah, exactly.
Now,
I'm retired now.
It's funny. Craig might not be familiar with all of the names you mentioned, but for me, growing up in England, Two Ronnies was an institution. I used to sit there with tears streaming down my cheeks watching their sketch show. Blackadder is one of the best written, most unique comedies of all time. Tracy Ullman, what a legend to work with, and her sketches were hilarious. So I mean, it's amazing to me. How did you get to write? How did you go about writing stuff that you knew was going to be funny? How do you write stuff that is funny?
It's very difficult to sort of give you a formula, because each joke, each gag has its own sort of, shall we say, its own weight of hilarity. See, comedy is like in the eye of the beholder. What some people think is funny, others people will think it's awful. You know, it's terrible. And today's comedians and things like that, you have to analyze what they are trying to do. I write in pictures. I can't do anything else other than write in pictures. So if I'm writing a gag, I've got to see the gag. See? Now I'll give you a quick gag that I did for Roy Hudd. Okay, it's a quick gag. It's you will probably understand it, Roland, more so than Craig, because it's got an English feel to it. Okay, but it's the scientists have discovered that the key to infertility is artificial insemination. Okay, which is what I've always said, that tubes help you breed more easily. So there you go.
I see. I do understand that, because it's it's the tagline of the tune's mental.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Craig's like,
yeah, well, comedy is definitely subjective, and I went to a comedy show here actually a couple weeks ago, and it was on so many levels of understanding. I didn't get all the jokes because I was part of this. I was invited, and everybody there was part of this group that went to a specific school. And This comedian was, some of his jokes were generic. I got those. Some of them were about the school. I didn't really get a lot of those. But also, he was South African, and everybody there was South African. So a lot of his jokes were South African. So I only got some of those. And it's like, it's same sort of thing. It's very subjective, right?
Yeah, it's subjective, because what you've got to remember is comedy is across all boards. All right, it covers everything. You've got comedy, like, for example, the comedy of Jimmy Carr, the comedy of Ricky Gervais, the Billy Connolly's, for example. They are all scenario comedies. They basically work on the idea of creating pictures for you, which is to a certain extent what I do. But then you have the comedy of going back to somebody like Lenny Bruce. Now, Lenny Bruce was all about teaching people how to understand comedy. It didn't matter what you were, whether you were black, white, Chinese, or Jewish, or whatever. His way of doing comedy was to educate, and there are some incredible sketches where he basically takes the audience and completely humiliates the audience, and by the time that particular sketch, or if you like, monologue, is over, he's got them crying in the aisle, because he was a complete genius, absolute genius. And people like that are, one in a million. They have the capacity to be able to not just talk about comedy, but be comics. People like, in England, Tony Hancock, terribly sad man, terribly sad, but a brilliant comic. The way that he could deliver lines was, second to none. And then you look at the people, like, for example, I will say Roy again. Roy was terribly underestimated. Roy had some amazing abilities. He could tell gags for going on for an hour, very much like Ken Dodd. Ken Dodd also could tell jokes, and in fact, he holds the Guinness World Records for telling jokes over a period of like 24 hours. I don't know how the audience stood it, but there you go. He told jokes for like 24 hours, and those kind of people. But now you have the satirical people, like, for example, Jimmy Carr, Ricky Gervais. Those guys are there to be controversial. They're not. They're there to be controversial, but at the same time to be funny. So if you find them funny, are you laughing at them, or are you laughing at yourself? Because this is the way that people are doing it, and all this woke nonsense and all the rest of it. I can't tell that joke. You can't tell that joke. Go and look at the Jewish books of jokes. There are bloody thousands of them. Thousands of Jewish jokes. And yet, if you tell the Jewish joke now, the woke society would be up in arms. If you tell a joke about a colored person, an Indian, or something like that, they would all be up in arms. Now, you talk about sitcoms. If you go back to the time when I was in the 80s, let's say the 80s, you had things like Only Fools and not Only Fools and Horses. You had things like Love Thy Neighbor. Love Thy Neighbor, for example, would never get on the TV now, ever. It was about a black guy and a white a black couple living next to a racist, and that's how they got on. He got on because he used to call him a white a honky, and the other one he called him whatever he called him, and but people found it funny. People found
I
I think that's it.
I think a lot of comedy is also, a reflection of the times that we live in, right? And as our times change, the comedy changes. If you look at, Archie Bunker, it's the same sort of thing. The All in the Family back in the day, and that was what many people now consider quite racist in some cases. Yes. But at the time, it was like one of the biggest shows on TV, right? So,
but Craig, you also have, with respect to the American side of things, you had a situation comedy called Soap, which was controversial in its own way. And that covered all different aspects. And you have Saturday Night Live, which hasn't really changed in format since its conception, from that point of view. And those kind of satirical programs were also very much in vogue at the time of that was the week that was. This was well back in the 70s, and then of course you had Python. When Python came along, you had to have an IQ of 120 to understand what the Python jokes were about, because these guys were all out of Cambridge. They were fresh out of Cambridge, and their comedy was so revolutionary by comparison to what the normal sort of knock on the door and, oh, is George there, and oh no, he's next door, and all the rest of it, and then somebody would trip on the doorstep, and that kind of British I suppose it's like a Carry On type comedy was completely taken away when Python came in. Python came in and changed the whole concept. But then remember, when Python was coming in, there was also the issue of women were wearing mini skirts, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, all of those people were about at the same time. So the revolution not only took over in comedy, but it also took over in the general consensus of that particular period of time. So, and comedy has to move with the times. I think that's sure. that's the essence of what it is, right from the very first joke that there was. There had to be an evolution of comedy, and that in many ways is what's happened.
Yeah, and I think, with the satirical stuff, that they're usually making satire of what's happening at that time, right? So, when you talk about like Soap and stuff, back in that day, that was they were poking fun at what was going on back then, and the shows that were going on. I think that was a takeoff of the daytime soap operas, and but if you look at Saturday Night Live, which you had also mentioned, they're doing satire of current events, and it's always current events, and those current events are always changing over time. So that's why it's stayed relevant. Whether it stayed funny, that's a different story. I think it used to be funny, not as much for me anymore. But younger kids, maybe they find it funny, right? So it's I think audience changes.
Would you find Rowan and Martin's laughing funny?
I don't know. I've never seen it.
Yeah, well, you see that Rowan and Martin's laughing was the equivalent of like, I suppose, the variety show, but with a comedy slant to it, because you had people like Marty Khan and all of these kind of people, great characters, who would then just do one-liners. They come out of a box, believe it or not, say a joke, and then go back in their box. This is how it was. It was that sort of cleaner comedy, as opposed to when the revolution came in, the situation comedy changed as well. Not for my liking to the better, because I still think the likes of On the Buses, which was a really good, funny funny program about a couple of bus driver and his conductor, which of course nobody has anymore. That they used to have some great situations, and then you Till Death Us Do Part, which was written by a guy called Mickey Spate. Till Death Us Do Part was so controversial, it was untrue, but people loved it. People absolutely loved it. The audiences would be in their millions watching it, you know, but you'd never get away with it now. And it's like, to a certain extent, I personally love Fawlty Towers. Okay, I think Fawlty Towers was a breath of fresh air, because Cleese made it in him the way that he made it. He made it so that it was unique. He only made 13 episodes, but now he's talking about bringing it back. I can't see how it can work, because the characters that he created are so difficult to reproduce. He, you know, as Fawlty himself, yes, he was an enigma, but it was also the surrounding characters, Manuel, the waiter, you know, the colonel, the incidental characters as well played such an important role. And when you go into comedy, you've got to realize that it's not just one central character, which is what the beauty of something like Only Fools and Horses is so good at, because they're the main two characters, Del Boy and Rodney, have around them the incidental characters who make up the show. The writing is brilliant. It was absolutely amazing, the writing. But the actual characterization, particularly with David Jason, the way that he created Rodney was amazing. I work with him on weekendings as well. Yes.
You know, Fawlty Towers and Only Fools and Horses, they're two wonderful examples of like real comedy writing that has a longer form. Like Fawlty Towers to me is one of the funniest shows ever, because over the course of half an hour, you'd have this main character, Basil Fawlty, getting himself into a situation and then getting himself deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and it becomes more excruciating. And it's almost, I used to watch it and feel like I had to get up and almost leave the room, because I was dying of secondhand embarrassment for the character of Basil Fawlty. But that's what made it so compelling. And then it would all wind up. So even though it had individual funny things in at the very end, like everything was funny about it. And Only Fools and Horses was another one. There was that wonderful episode about them. They were trying to, Rodney and Derek were trying to, sorry, Del Boy, as they call them, were trying to pull a fast one on these two Indian gentlemen who claimed that because they're of separate castes, they couldn't speak to each other. And one of them had this rare thing that he wanted to sell, and the other one was going to buy it. And so Del Boy and Rodney thought they could be the intermediaries and make a killing on this. But the very end of it was the fact that actually they'd got swindled. And it was just such one, it was funny throughout. You were laughing throughout, but the end, because the whole comedy thing was leading to this conclusion, it just made it so hysterical. I think there's so much you can learn from writing by looking at those long form shows and seeing how well.
Absolutely. And the thing is, what we've got to remember is writing, even if it's a book, if it's a sketch, it always has to have a twist. There must be something of a twist in it, in the story, or in the final line, or something like that, because you know you've got to have a punchline. Without that punchline, a joke has to have a punchline. Without the punchline, the joke is lost. It's just a piece of literal words. That's all it is. But the punchline is crucial. Good comedians will do a punchline, but then they'll follow it up with another punchline, with something that you don't expect. And that's the essence of very good comedy, because they're in a situation where they've created the story for you. They've taken you to the end of the story. They've given you the punchline. And then just as you're expecting it, that's the end of the joke, there's another punchline. And that makes all the difference because, anybody can tell a joke, but you can tell a joke poorly and that doesn't get you a laugh. Tell a joke with a punchline and then another punchline and you'll have them rolling in the aisles.
Yeah, and I think, when you're writing a longer form, like a novel or something, you can't just have, a series of characters telling jokes to each other. The story itself has to be funny. The characters, their interactions are generally funny. There's usually, some sort of misadventure going on or a twist or something. But then, at the end of it, if you can even add in sort of a punchline to the entire story, even though throughout the story there were all these little punchlines, you can't, you don't want to like have no punchlines throughout the whole story, and you have to read the book to get to the punchline, and that's when you have your one laugh, right? You want to have laughs all the way through, and then if you can have an even bigger laugh, and I think you have to think about who your audience is and the kind of humor that you want to deliver to them, and that also makes a big difference in terms of how you're going to write your comedy and what kind of comedy you're going to put in.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, because if you're doing stand-up, something I would never have considered in my lifetime, I'll tell you, stand-up is just so difficult to do, because unless you're known, you can get up. If you're a known person, you can get up and tell a band of jokes, and those jokes don't necessarily have to be the brilliant jokes, because they'll laugh at anything if it's you. Okay. If it's somebody that's new and they're going up onto the stage and they're testing the mic, for example, or it's mic night, for example, you've got to be really good, because you've got people there that are going to heckle you like nobody's business. You've got other people there who are not going to find you funny, even if you're the best in the world. You've got to break into that in a unique and innovative way that actually sets you aside from the rest of the other set that is doing the same sort of thing as you are doing. So that's where the imagination of a comic has to come into play. And it has to be something that is worked on, unless you have brilliantly natural talent. If you have natural talent, fine, you don't have an issue. But you look at people who have gone on stage and have crashed, and you think to yourself, you poor buggers, it's unfortunate, but you're just not cut out for that. And I'm not saying, I'm not being derogatory or anything to anybody, but there are people, I'm not mentioning names or anything, but there are groups on Facebook, and I've watched people on Facebook, and this is to help these people who are on Facebook. They come on and they will write some gags, okay, in a particular group. I read the gag and I'm thinking to myself, well, that's just not funny. Why is that not funny? Why have they written this without thinking it through? If there's a gag, think it through. Think of what your punchline is going to be, or it's just prose. At the end of it, it's just a prose. There's no humor to it. And humor is the most difficult thing to write. And everybody, in that particular scenario, when they have gone on to their particular thing on Facebook and have written their gag or whatever and have asked for comments, the comments have been really quite harsh, because it's not funny. But these poor people are trying to do it, but they're just not funny. And unfortunately, sometimes it works like that. Comedy is something that you have to nurture, or it's inherent in your particular, shall we say, abilities. I'm not being cruel, because I don't want to be cruel to people, but you do see an awful lot of people who try so hard to be funny and they're just not funny.
And some people don't need to try at all and they're hilarious.
Yes, exactly. Yes, absolutely. Some people can walk on stage. You know as well as I do, Roland. Tommy Cooper, absolute genius, right? Absolute genius. All he could do was walk on stage with his fez hat on, and people will actually laugh at him, and he hadn't done a bloody thing. He'd done nothing. He's just walked on stage. He says, cup of this, cup, and then he walks off. You know. Do you know Tommy Cooper was on stage at the London Palladium doing a variety show, and it was coming up to the interval, and he coming through the curtain, and as he was coming through the curtain, he had a heart attack on stage and died on stage at the London Palladium. Okay, and when his hand slid down the curtain, people in the audience were laughing and laughing and laughing because they thought it was part of the act. That's how much influence he had as a performer. There was absolute genius, was Tommy Cooper. Absolute genius.
They
And he was there to the end.
They thought
Sorry?
that about Lenny Bruce. They thought that about Lenny Bruce, right? When he died, they thought it was a big
Yes.
joke. I thought he was playing a joke on that.
Wow, it puts a whole different spin on it when you hear comedians say, "Oh, I died last night on stage."
Yeah. Well, that's a
Or I
different
killed.
that's a slightly different interpretation, definitely.
Yeah, I was
But-
just going to say, talking about comedy, the other thing that I'd love your insight on is one of the things that has always existed around comedy is the idea of speaking truth to power, and talking about things that you wouldn't normally be able to talk about. And that's why court jesters appeared. Court jesters were the only ones who could speak truth to the king, because they made it a joke. And and some of the shows that you've worked on and people you've worked with, I was thinking of Blackadder. I mean, the final season of Blackadder set in World War I was it was hilarious, but it was writing about real meaningful stuff as well at the same time.
And the end scene, the most poignant scene of all, that has been recognized as probably the most, shall we say, significant piece of comedy writing. I think Richard Griffiths wrote that. And it's been recognized as the most poignant scene in British comedy writing, because of nobody expected that. No one at all expected that. And when you can get something like that, so that is heartrending, and actually brings you to tears, even though you're supposed to be thinking that this is funny. That's pure genius. That's absolute pure genius. But you take Blackadder as a very good example. Blackadder did, in fact, go overboard in some ways, because what it did was some of the jokes and things like that were all detrimental. Poor old what's his name?
Baldrick.
Baldrick. Yeah, Baldrick was the slap guy for everything from that point of view. But of course, the Blackadder itself, he was also subject to, shall we say, ridicule as well, because when the Queen used to insult him and things like that, and he was a foil for a lot of the comedy. Some of the stuff that went through in the earlier part, where it was like the Elizabethan times, those times, they had some amazing characters. The guy who died recently, the Scottish guy, Robbie Coltrane. Robbie Coltrane was in that era as well. And so there were so many different characterizations, but those particular, shall we say, elements of the writing were done on character. They were done on character. They weren't done on situation. They were purely created from the characters themselves, and the situations would then develop around them, and that's the essence of very good comedy. And if you take them into different, shall we say, put them into different boxes. You've got situation comedies. Let's look at, say, for example, Butterflies. Butterflies, there was a British comedy, and it was about a dentist and his wife was thinking about having an affair, and he had two young boys. They had two young boys. And basically it was gentle comedy. It was really gentle, but there was, it was pathos in it. There was also very good humor as well, but it was all character. Everything was all about character, not necessarily the situation itself, but mainly the characters that actually develop. And there are so many like that have done that sort of thing. Whereas I think today you'd find it difficult to write the kind of situation comedies that were around in the 80s, 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It would be very difficult to write those sort of things because of the society that we have.
Right, society's changed for sure, and sometimes I'll watch a lot of those old sitcoms that I liked as a kid, and then I watch them with my kids now, and I'm like, ooh, I don't know how they got away with doing those things, but it was a different time, right? But I agree,
absolutely.
The characters are really what make comedy, I think, most of the time. Like, you can have a funny situation, sure, but like you need those characters that are funny or quirky or have their specific, often they'll have something, about that character that, they don't like this type of thing. And so you put them in a situation where that thing is happening and it's funny, right? But if you put in a different character, it wouldn't be funny, right? It's that combination of character and situation, but the characters themselves, they're funny, and you can put them in many different situations, and which is why the sitcoms have many episodes, right? And they're always around the same characters because the characters are funny, right? But you just keep putting them in different situations. And I think if you can write those kind of characters that mesh well together, that play off of each other, then that's like one of the winning formulas, I think, to having a sitcom or one of these kinds of types.
Well, I mean, a prime example in the American market is Friends. Okay, Friends, in its own way, created its own genre, because what it did was it united all the different characters together, put them in different situations. Although the majority of the situations were taking place in the flats or in the locality, in the cafe bar, they didn't really go too far out of the locations, except when they went to off location, like when they went to the UK and things like that, or they went to Vegas. But it was still characterization, very much so. Same as 2.5 Men, the same principle with 2.5 Men. It was about the characterization, the little boy and the brother and the two brothers themselves. So I mean, it's all that sort of that way. But what you have to analyze above all is it funny? Because if it's not funny, there's no point in doing it. It has to be funny. I mean, look at the different shows that there have been on and have just been killed because they're just not funny. People don't watch them, So I mean, it can be very, very, very hit and miss in some cases. But if you've got the right people doing the right job, then you're okay.
Yeah, and a lot of times it is specific to the audience that you're delivering to, but then some things transcend that even, right? Like if you look at a lot of British shows that they take and then they make them into American shows and they still do well, like The Office, right? Ricky Gervais, that became a massive hit in the US as well, and it was completely redone. And I mean, a lot of the episodes were similar, but you guys have 6 or 8 episodes in a season, right? Where they got to translate that into a 22 to 24 episode season in the US, so they build it more, but they could do that because the characters were so strong and so well written, and played off of each other.
And a lot of that is to do with the individuality that Ricky Gervais brings to everything, because he is a very, very clever man. If you've ever watched Afterlife,
Yeah.
Afterlife is a brilliant series, and it blends comedy so well with the pathos of everything. But he actually makes you laugh and he makes you cry, and if you can do that, you're a success.
Yeah, he's one of my favorites for sure.
Yeah, he is definitely a comic genius. Same as Billy Connolly. I think Billy Connolly is, in his own way, a comic genius, because he took the situation, he took the stand-up comedy to a new level completely.
So unfortunately, we are rounding out the top of the hour. So we could probably sit here and chat about comedy for ages. I think we've only gone through like some of we started to find some shows that Craig knew and I knew together. But I think it's been so fascinating to listen to you talk about comedy and how comedy can impact people and resonate with people and like make a connection with people, which is at the end of the day what all writers want to do, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's if you can affect somebody, whether you're writing a book, for example, and at the end of that book, somebody turns around and goes, "Oh, I love that book. That was brilliant," or they shed a tear, then you've achieved something. That's what it's all about. You want emotion, and at the same time, you want that emotion to be recognized, because a writer doesn't want to just write for himself. He wants to write for people.
Well, isn't that a brilliant note to end things on? So, Myron, where can people find out more about you?
Well, I have a website. My own website is myronedwardsbooks.com. On there, you'll find all of the books that I've written. The first book I wrote was The Mistress of the Rock, which is a story about something that happened to me a long time ago. It's basically the epiphany moment that I had when I was at Aphrodite's Rock in Cyprus. So I won't go any more than that, only to say that if you want to see what I saw, go onto the YouTube video, which is at the bottom of the website, and you will see for yourself what I saw. And then there's a sequel to that, which is Skylar the Revenge, and then a follow-up, the third book, which is Julie's Odyssey, Alpha and Omega. It's all to do with contemporary Greek history.
Well, that is wonderful. We will shove a link down below in the description of this video so people can go and check those out. And while they're down there checking out those links, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment from Myron to let us know how much you appreciate everything he's had to share here. And of course, hit that bell notification so you get updated with every new episode of Fully Booked as they come out. Do you have any final words, Craig?
No, I mean, just thank you for coming on, Myron. This was a fascinating discussion of comedy throughout, the years and how it's changed, how it's evolved, the different aspects of it in film and in TV and writing. And it was a pleasure having you on. So much to talk about, and this this time really flew by really, really quickly. You've had a great storied career.
Thank you very much, and I do appreciate the opportunity, and I wish you guys all the best. And hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to you again. All the very best to you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Myron. And thank you, everyone who tuned in, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on your podcast. We really appreciate you supporting us, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye-bye.